good to see you. Thank you. So I'm curious. Are there many of y'all who are not from around here? Well, welcome. It's good to have you here. I want to say when I set out to write this book, I had no intention of writing about my dad or my family or any of that. I had been, I've been covering Alabama politics for a long time, which is sort of like a disease, I guess. But it had really bothered me over the course of time how it just seemed like if you look through the history of Alabama, you have, just post-Civil War, you have the Civil War, you have Reconstruction and all the turmoil that happened there, you have the 1901 Constitution, which was written for the express purpose of codifying white supremacy as law. You have Jim Crow, you have lynchings and burnings and bombings and, I'm leaving out the Tuskegee syphilis experiment and everything, and then what happened in Birmingham. And it just kept striking me, based on the people I knew, based on the people I'd grown up with, based on what I thought, it did not compute. And all I could think of was, what would have happened if people of so-called goodwill, the ones who were always coming into my dad's churches and things like that, had simply stood up in those times and said, this doesn't seem quite right to me, and I couldn't quite understand how, how in this time, in any time, people could look at things that are sort of obviously unjust and not say, I got a problem with that. And so I set out to try to find a way to figure that out. And I was looking all over the place, and ultimately, I did something I never did as a child. Well, let me say, I'm the son of a Methodist preacher, who was the son of a Methodist preacher, who was the son of a Methodist preacher. My grandfather on the other side was a Methodist preacher. I got an uncle who's a Methodist preacher, an aunt who's a Methodist preacher. Now I got a cousin who's a Methodist preacher. And I had preachers going back all the way to 1740 that I could find. And if you've ever read me or if you know anything about me, you know that long lineage of Methodist preachers came to a screeching halt when it reached me. So I had never really, I grew up in churches, and so all of that I know seeped into my DNA in some way, so that all the rhythms of church came into me. But I didn't really listen to my dad's sermons growing up. So using those fantastic reporting skills she just described, I one day wandered into my basement a few years after my dad had died and found a file cabinet about this big, stored in my garage, my basement garage, with the white tape across the front, this big, that said Daddy's Sermons written on the front in 2-inch letters. And so I said, wow, maybe I'll be able to know what he said. All this in the context of the fact that I was born in Alabaster when my dad was pastor of First Methodist Church of Alabaster in April of 1963. And if you know anything about Birmingham's history or civil rights history, you know that April 1963 was when Martin Luther King Jr. came to Birmingham, and he and Shuttlesworth marched, and Dr. King was thrown in jail, where he wrote a letter from a Birmingham jail, which is one of the most amazing documents of the civil rights movement, and really one of the most amazing documents I've ever read, primarily because it was written in jail on scraps of newsprint and notepad and put together afterwards. And it was written in response to a bunch of preachers in Birmingham who said, had written in the newspaper that, now's not the time. It's not the time for protest. Let it go. And he responded with this letter, this amazing letter, that both explains the need for protest at times and excoriated the white church for its almost universal silence on issues of civil rights and race. And so this April of 1963, this is happening in Birmingham, and I'm being born 20 miles away in Alabaster. And through the course of my life and my dad's life, I'd never, for whatever reason, got around to asking my dad, what he was saying from his pulpit at this moment in time when Dr. King was saying, "Why aren't you helping us? I thought you were allies, and instead you've been quiet, or worse." And I like to think that with all those preachers in my family tree, that we were the good ones, right? We were not the problem, surely. So I tell myself sometimes, why didn't I ask my dad what he was saying at that time? Because I assumed that we were the good ones. But when I think a little bit harder about it, did I not ask my dad what was going on there because I was afraid to know the answer? And he died in 13, and I thought I'd never know. And that's when, so I walked down and I found that file cabinet with my dad, who was terribly organized, which I'm grateful for. But I will say, we're Methodists, so Methodists moved every 5 years or so back then, which made it great because I realized that my dad would recycle his sermons from church to church so that it didn't take quite as long as it could. As I told the group this morning, I was fine with him recycling sermons, but then I noticed too he had a file of funerals where he had recycled a few of those. Not sure that's the best idea. But the first sermon I looked at was from April of 1963, right after I'd been born. And it was on this, on the church calendar, it was called Children's Sunday, the Methodist church calendar, which basically says, hey, it'd be a good idea to talk about children at this time. So he preached a sermon on Children's Sunday about children. And this was in the middle of what has become known as the Children's Crusade in Birmingham, Alabama, one of the most significant moments in civil rights history, in this cradle of the civil rights movement. And thousands of kids left school to march for civil rights. And Bull Connor responded with dogs and fire hoses, which everybody knows the images. They went across the world. And the next week was Children's Sunday. And my dad talked about all the troubles of the world. It's a troubling time. He talked about troubles in Africa and Asia and South America and places I'd never heard of, but he didn't talk about troubles downtown. He didn't talk about troubles outside his stained glass windows or in his pews. He talked about the troubles that were far away. And it just struck me. Number one, what struck me was the silence of it all. And what struck me was it's so much easier to dwell on problems that are far away than they are the ones that hit you right in the face. And so the book is my attempt to figure out why. To figure out why this man who taught me everything that I have come to believe about fairness and equality and treating people as people could have, the strongest person I ever knew, to be honest, who was always there for anyone who needed him, how he would not be able to find his voice in this time of immense change, in this place of such importance in history. And so that what became of the book. So people say this is a book about my dad. And I guess in some ways it is, but I don't think of it as a book about my dad. I think of it as a book that uses my father as a vehicle to talk about who we choose to be on any given day. And it's a perfect example of you don't know where you are in history on any given day. You don't know the significance of the moment. You don't know where you are in any particular place. So what does that tell us? That we have to decide who we're going to be every day, right? And so that sort of motivated me. But what I really came to discover was this conspiracy of silence, as I came to think about it, that demanded in that era that people in pulpits, in law offices, often in places of business, people who really had influence and authority it asked them not to speak up against these things that were obviously, that from my perspective anyway, is unjust. And so I began to talk to, really a lot of first of all, I should say that the whole reason I wrote this book is because I think we need conversation about these things, because I don't think we have them enough. So at any time I'm talking, if somebody has an idea and wants to say, hey, don't hesitate to interrupt me and do that. But I started talking to a lot of my dad's peers, the people who grew up with him, who were preachers with him, who were going through the same sort of questions he was. And almost to a one, when I would ask them, hey, I don't understand this. I just don't understand. The person I know as a human was unable to say the things that I knew he believed to the people who came to him for spiritual guidance. How does that mesh? And they would, to a one, say, he did it for you. He did it for you because if he had spoken out against this, he would have been relegated to a small church, or he would have been moved out of state, or he would have had crosses burned in his yard, or he would have been denied. He would have failed to climb the ladder in the church, and he would have made less money, and your life would have been worse. And they told me this to make me feel better, I suppose. But it did not make me feel better because it made me feel complicit in this. But it also, it got me asking questions of all those preachers who went through it. And I use preachers because that's what I'm dealing with here. But, it goes far beyond the church, far beyond any of that, into every element of the society we had here. And I talked to preachers who they described, a top-down sort of prohibition from talking about any of these issues of race that might cause division in the church, which, of course, I'm from the Methodist Church, which is full of division still. And I talked to some who did say, I saw injustice and I couldn't help but talk about it. And one in particular who said, and I did do that. He described having a cross burned in his yard. He described being relegated to a small church in South Alabama for the rest of his career. And he actually wrote to me, and this is in the book, that he wrote to me right before he died and talked about having made that choice and how his family did sort of suffer financially and how he suffered and how, as he was staring in the face of death, it was the proudest thing he ever did in his entire life. And he wouldn't change a thing. And on the other hand, I talked to preachers who, towed the company line, as it were, and held their tongue and didn't say the things that they thought they might need to say, and had a very different experience. And one of the first, this book published during COVID, so a lot of the book talks were done on Zoom. And the first week after I'd done it, I did one with this group of retired Methodist preachers from North Alabama who were some very big names that were legendary in my household, and I knew they were very good friends with my father, and I was scared to death. And so I got on that call, and number one, they'd all read it or claimed to. I did learn the biggest lie ever told is I read your book, but they got on there, and one of the most revered preachers, at least from my family's perspective, and a guy who'd done so much good in the world, got on there and just started openly crying, and saying, and this is a guy who's done a lot of good in the world, and just saying, I wish I had done more, and I think that ultimately that seemed to be the unifying theme throughout that. But there was just so much pressure, and it did create. One of the guys in the book talked about a conspiracy of silence, where the things that happened throughout this era were sort of systematically and intentionally forgotten. And if I look at people in my generation, people who born after 1963, who didn't have any real personal memories of what was going on in Birmingham, Alabama, and from 55 to 65, for instance, for people who don't know, they called Birmingham Bombingham, and a lot of people think that that's because of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing that killed those 4 little girls. But there were almost 50 bombs in Birmingham between 1945 and 1965, and they didn't end after the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. So, I mean, it was a crazy thing, and we don't talk about it very much. But it had a profound effect on us. Birmingham and Atlanta were the same size in 1950, if you didn't know. You can imagine that. And Atlanta called itself the city that was too busy to hate. And Birmingham wasn't that busy. But a lot of the people who grew up in my era just had no concept, no understanding, no belief of it all. So I think that's an incredible part of it. I will say, I always end up, when I talk about these things, I always end up focusing on all that part of it, making it sound like it's the most heavy, dark book that there is, but I try to make sure that's not the case. I lay awake many nights thinking, I'm doing this search. I'm looking at this man who is, I mean, in my eyes, again, like I said, the man on the pedestal to me, and I'm trying to hold him to account for things that I don't understand. But at the same time, I really want you to be able to decide who this man is. So I have to tell you how I saw him as well. So I like to think that there's a lot of humor and a lot of other types of stories in there that make it, that balance out a little bit of the heaviness and show the growth along the way. I got tons of calls from people who knew my dad as they were reading it, and they'd say, when I got halfway through, I hated you. But when I got to the end, I loved you again. So, I mean, it is a story of growth and a little bit of redemption, but it also, primarily for me, is a story about us, all of us, and our sort of decision every day in every place to decide who we're going to be. And people ask me all the time, well, what do you want people to do? And it's a good question, because I wrote this in 2019. It was supposed to print in 2020, but COVID happened, and it had ended up in 21. And, it's 24 now. And it's 1,000 years since 2019, right? So when I in 19 was worried about people not knowing how to speak out, we're talking about a different animal now. But the question of how we speak out is, I think, really, really relevant to all of us, because all I want people to do, and all I would have wanted people, and what I would have wanted people to do throughout that part of history when we talk about that silence, is to simply have the ability or the will to look at something that they think is unjust and say, I think that's wrong. That doesn't seem quite right. I mean, what we see so often now is people, telling each other how wrong they are. People telling each other they need to think like them, demonizing those who don't think like them. And none of that has any effect at all. And I can tell you, and I can check my email right now and see something that's going to say I'm an idiot. And I can promise you that I have never been convinced by being called an idiot. And I don't think anybody ever is. But I think that it's really, really valuable for us to be able to say, I don't think that's quite right. And to let people know, and I'm not saying you have to agree with me. I'm saying it's really important for you to be able to say that without fear or regret or retribution. And that's what I ask for. Again, I concentrate on all the dark things, but there's lots of cases in which, lots of stories in there that I hope are a little more fun and funny. And many stories of my near death, which are the best memories ever. Aren't they? But what I really want to do is I hope that you have some questions, because it's always a lot more fun when we have questions, especially for people who lived through this era or people who have their own sort of experiences they would like to share. So does anybody have any questions or any specifics? Hey.
One, I have in fact read your book.
Well, thank you. Who believes him?
And many years ago in Atlanta, when I lived in Atlanta, I lived next door to Bishop Nolan Harmon, who was one of the bishops to whom Martin Luther King addressed his letter. And he had retired by that time. And what I was struck by was how he wasn't really reflecting on that particular time. He, maybe it was because of his age and he was a bit older, but he did not want to talk about that at all. So I guess what I'd really like to ask you is, who are your heroes? Did you encounter some Methodists or other preachers who did speak out?
Yeah, John Rutland was amazing, and he's in the book. John, there's some debate in my family whether I was named for John Rutland or John the Baptist, but I'm going with Rutland, and he was Bull Connor's preacher at Woodlawn Methodist Church back in the day, and was called out on a number of occasions by Bull Connor for preaching those inward sermons, and held his own pretty well. And he's one of the few people who was able to still maintain a good career while still saying what needed to be said, due largely to his ability to be charming and helpful to people who needed help, I think. And that's the other thing about speaking out. People say, "Well, what do you say?" And that's you say what you would say within your own personality, within your own comfort level, with something you filter through your heart in the only way that's true. It doesn't. And I think with John Rutland, he could talk about it without being accusing. And I think that was important. But also, Charles Morgan. I don't know if Charles Morgan was a lawyer, and on the day after the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, when those 4 little girls were killed, he gave a speech to the Young Men's Business Club downtown, which still exists, although it is neither young nor men, nor associated with much business. But he gave this speech, and it was essentially, it was a damning speech that said, we've been watching this stuff happen for ever, in this town with more churches than anybody, in this town where, we live in segregated housing, and we, on and on. He said, it was essentially, who threw that bomb? Well, we're just as responsible. And he got essentially run out of town for it, and threatened, and all that. Went on to do great things in law. But the people who are willing, I think, to put themselves on the line in positions where they have risk, really do get to me. But those guys would be the first to come to mind.
Hey, but what I don't understand is the businesses. It just made no sense to restrict or to do things. In your research, did you find that there was a move, and then was it squashed? Were there not any businesses who were brave enough to besides that nicer time?
Well, I mean, it's complicated. Number one, you got to put yourself back in that time. It seems so crazy right now that you're in a time where it would have been illegal for you to sit down and have a conversation on your front porch with a black person. You know, this is a time when rather than integrate swimming pools, they drained them. Rather than integrate golf courses, they poured concrete in the holes. You know, and this is, you know, to imagine that this happened in my lifetime, which I still consider to be pretty young, although I'm realizing that's a lie. But I mean, it's still stunning to me that this happens then, and that there was intense pressure. You know, I mean, and the Klan was a powerful force. I mean, that's why all these bombs were being placed. You know, it's like, you know, when there was pressure on businesses that they would lose business, that they would be put out of business. I mean, I think a lot of people had legitimate fears that their life would be made more difficult if they bucked the system. And whether that was a realistic thing for a lot of people, it was certainly a realistic belief that, and time after time, people would tell me of, you know, threats or promises or actual events that occurred to them, and and those bombs were real. Not all of them went off, but there were plenty of them, and so I think that the atmosphere of terror was way more than we can even really imagine now, and even for people who lived through them, there was a sort of a disconnect with a lot of people, a lot of white people, who weren't paying that much attention, and there was a great forgetting, you know, because we reached this point where we just didn't talk about it. I mean, I grew up here across North Alabama, and I had to go to, it was after, I mean, I went to college in Alabama. I got out and I had to be, you know, and it was in my job when I finally ever heard of the letter from a Birmingham jail, where I ever realized and studied really what had happened here, where I was stunned to find out that, you know, all these bombs happened in my city, where the only thing I knew about civil rights was people saying, I'm tired of seeing those pictures of dogs and fire hoses, because that was 1963, and that ain't us anymore. And so if you grew up here in that time, as a white person, what you heard was that we're post-racial. That doesn't happen anymore. That was the 60s. And that's not the case. And so I think all of those reasons are part of them.
You and I have a mutual friend in Joseph Bryant,
Yeah.
who was a colleague of yours.
Yeah, I just got a call from him, and I didn't call him back.
Some while ago, Joseph was in the pulpit at Cherry Street A&E in Dothan, and you were there to speak for a program that he had put together. And I was there and had another engagement, so I had to leave before you spoke. And I regretted that because, of course, I had gone to support Joseph, who's a great guy. I wanted to hear your presentation and gauge the reaction of the congregation of that church, and I wasn't able to. So I put the question to you today. In your mind, is there an appreciable difference in how your message is received in a minority crowd versus, say, a crowd like this?
Well, yeah, it's interesting. And they were great, by the way. That was one of the most fun things I'd done in a while. And it's really, to me, it's really so much better to speak to a group, a diverse group, because there are different perspectives and there's opportunities for people to say things that they might otherwise not say. And that's the problem we have around here, is we have too few real conversations about this. And I'm not just saying about history, I'm saying about how we can have conversations and how we can sort of understand each other's points of view. And there's nothing in the world, I can say to someone of color about racism or discrimination, but I can speak from, a position of privilege about, the responsibilities that I see that we have to look at injustice and say, that's not something that we have to feel guilty about for the future. That's something we have to look at today and say, what can we do now to just make sure that we treat people fairly? And so, the conversations we have across those lines are so much better. And I really like talking to people, back and forth in that situation, because that's what this is all about. We've got to be able to talk to people like human beings and understand the things that they go through. Otherwise, we start banning books that have, actual history in them, so that, we begin to worry about whether people will look, and these are the most frustrating things. That's what's going on, because all of a sudden you can't look back and learn from it. But anyway, I'm curious if there are people who grew up in this environment and have perspective. Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, I was just trying to solicit somebody to talk.
One of my very earliest memories is seeing Kennedy's funeral cortege on TV, and we had black and white TV. But not too long after that, I remember seeing the pictures of, people getting hit with fire hoses and stuff. And I was thinking about my own family as you were talking. So my grandparents, y'all are going to appreciate this if you're from here. My grandparents had pictures of George Wallace and Lurleen Wallace in the hallway of their house when I was growing up. But my mother, since you grew up here, you will know what this means. She was a member of the Birmingham Urban League. And I remember this picture that was in my house of her, and she was the only person not of color in the photograph. And I just remember that being a thing in my family. And I know it was discussed.
That was your grandmother?
No, that was my mother. Was part of the Birmingham Urban League.
Who was your mother?
Ann Hatfield. You wouldn't necessarily know her, I don't think. She's been gone a long time now. But I just, when you're talking about these things, and I remember my grandfather being so incredibly prejudiced. And I've told this story about him to friends growing up, and especially people who are not from here. They don't understand it. They can't believe it. I don't understand it. Yeah.
That's the thing. No, the degree of, and I honestly don't know if it's forgetfulness or if it's just a huge gap in the knowledge of so many white people who lived here. But it's a very real thing. I did a podcast a few years ago on the shooting death of Benita Carter, who was a young black woman who was killed by Birmingham police in 1979. And that's what it prompted huge protest, very much sort of Black Lives Matter, decades before Black Lives Matter, and people came from around the country, and there was protest, and it ended up, changing the city government, and Richard Arrington was then elected first black mayor, and many things changed, and so I went back. I wanted to, I remembered it as a kid. I guess I was almost an adult, but I remembered it, and I wanted to go back and look at that story, and fortunately, it was really, really well documented from testimony and hearings from witnesses and that sort of thing. And as I read that testimony, I realized that the story, and I'd previously asked a lot of the people involved about what had happened. But when I went back and read all the testimony and even the news stories of the day, everybody was wrong. And the story that white people told about it was one story that was very wrong, and the story a lot of black people told about it was another story that was closer to right, but often somewhat wrong as well. But, and it seems like, and it was just saying that we tell ourselves these different stories that often have very little basis in truth in order to sort of support our feelings of justification. The white story we told that she had robbed a convenience store and was taking off and running from the police and was shot. And the real story was that somebody had called her and said, there's a car, they left their car outside this place, would she bring it to their house? And she went and brought it to their house and got shot. So, because somebody had been somebody had gotten in a fight at a convenience store. But at any rate, the interesting thing is that, we tell ourselves a lot of myths which is the same as saying, don't study what actually happened. And that gets us in a lot of trouble. But anyway, there's anybody else? We got one right.
How do you see the role of social media today being against people talking to each other?
Well, we do a lot of talking at each other. And and it's all ends of the spectrum. If you disagree, you're evil. And I'm in a position where I can write anything, that the sky is blue, and half the people will tell me, God, that's the most beautiful blue I ever saw in my life, and the other half will tell me, you're an idiot, it's raining, or whatever. So whatever you say, people are going to disagree. But we found that we disagree with such vitriol that people are afraid not only to garner the wrath of the people they disagree with, but they're even more afraid to offend the people that are more aligned with them, because then they will feel like they're being pushed out of their group. So all of a sudden we have everybody who's afraid to say anything but what aligns with people that they think they agree with. Which makes it very, very difficult to have a real conversation about anything. And especially because, it's an insidious thing. It really keeps us from being able to have the conversations we need to have about every issue, honestly. And that's not just social media. That's also because of the fragmentation of media, where, because of business models and the internet and everything else, we have people getting news and information, not that will contribute to a community conversation, but that will feed us only the things that we find palatable. So we operate on separate sets of facts and makes those things difficult to talk to. I don't know if that's what you, yeah, but it's with other advances, the advent of AI and all these things, I have great fear that will only get worse, which it makes it more important for us to be able to, discern what is real and what is not, which is hard.
Do you find that the same way that people acted toward, the racial issue, now that they're maybe getting a little better about that, they're swapping it over to another group, like the LGBTQ population? It seems like that some of the people in our church, that it's a very liberal church, but we still have a few older people that are taking a minute to pull along, but they seem much more okay with, people that are black, even people that are gay, but they can't wrap their head around a trans thing, and so racked with misinformation.
Right.
That the things coming out of their mouth now sound very similar to the things that came out of people's mouth about racial issues.
Yeah, and I'm remiss because I guess when I talk about Birmingham, I focus all on the Birmingham part of this thing. But the second half of my book is about that issue. It's about, when my oldest brother came out in 1972, when my dad was a preacher at First Methodist Church in Decatur, Alabama, which you can imagine in 1972 that would have been a thing. So the other half is how he dealt with that and into the split in the Methodist Church because of gay marriage and clergy and gay clergy and that sort of thing. But what was really interesting to me in that, and looking at that, is that in 1960 there was a big effort. And again, I'm looking at the Methodist Church not because it's a book about the Methodist Church, but because that's what I was looking at through the lens of. And there was huge meetings in churches to make sure that no money was spent on anything that would encourage any kind of integration of the church, that we couldn't have that no preacher could speak against segregation and all these sorts of things. And if you go and look at the rhetoric that was being used at that time to keep the church segregated, it is almost identical to the rhetoric that is used in the Methodist conferences to justify the split over the LGBTQ issues. And of course, what we've seen more lately with sort of anti-trans stuff is sort of next level thing. So there's a lot of similarities in people who just, in my view, in just the movements to either disenfranchise or make people who are a little different feel uncomfortable or unwelcome.
Actually, I heard some comments the same week about, we don't mind people coming, we just don't want to see it all. We don't like the fact that people are advocating and they're up in our face about it.
Yeah, they can do what they want, just don't tell me. Yeah.
It's literally like one or two people in all church, but it's just kind of the same week, and it made me think about it.
Yeah, it's crazy how all this is done in the name of liberty. But anyway, sorry, I have some feelings about that, forgive me. But, I can't, it goes back to, there's a hypocrisy, of a lot of things. And I couldn't get over the fact that, in some of these instances we were talking about, the very churches where people were singing, I guess it's politically correct in its own way, incorrect in some ways now, but red and yellow, black and white, Jesus loves them in his sight. At the same time, the usher was in the back of the door making sure no black people came in. So, it's just there's so much irony in our face all the time that we almost don't even see it. And so, anyway, I didn't mean to preach because that's not my thing. I get it comes in the DNA sometimes. But at the same time, again, the only point I want to make is that, I think that when people are able, who feel comfortable enough saying something as simple as, I disagree with that, or that's not the way I feel. I think it has a power that we don't appreciate, and I think it has so much more power than simply than to tell somebody they're wrong. And I know that might be ironic coming from me because some people think I'm opinionated, but I think that honestly, but giving somebody something to think about and an understanding that when they presume that you share their opinions that you don't share, that they know it. So anyway, that's what I'm about. Did anybody else have a question? Hey.
So I had a similar awakening about my father from that time period. I'm curious, did you ever reconcile yourself with your father's position?
Well, first of all, people ask me sometimes if I ever forgave my father. I don't have anything to forgive, first of all. I love my dad with all my heart, and I know that, throughout his life, he did what he could to help people when he could. And for whatever reason, he didn't talk at this particular moment in time. I think it's more of me trying to understand the time that caused that than that. But, and I think I write about this in the book, but the last time I'm going to probably cry if I say it. The last time I saw him, he was in hospice in Decatur, and I went up, and and he couldn't really talk at the time, but he could say a few words, and he made this little thing like which I took to mean what are you writing about? Because that's what he would ask, and I told him something, and I can't remember exactly the story now, but it was something that it was. I wish I could remember the story, but it was a story about race, and about some of the problems that were here, and about one of the churches that had an issue, and he nodded, and then and he hadn't been able to talk all that whole visit, and he reached over and grabbed my arm, and he said, I'm proud of you for taking on the issue of race. And I write stuff in Birmingham, Alabama, and I've got to do that, but in my heart, I took that as sort of a blessing, and I think that in many ways I felt like, that's why I lay awake all those nights in those 2 years before this thing published, thinking, am I being fair to him, or am I giving him too much benefit of the doubt, and trying to balance those? But in my heart, I took that as, in my heart, I believe he would have been proud of the message, and that's what most of the people who've read it, who know him, believe. So I feel good about that. Thank you.